All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is Daily Vlog 2025, number 38. I gotta set my glasses. Of course I did. Clean them off real quick. So, I will talk without my glasses for just a second here. So, today, I want to talk about the world of Exandria. I'm going to mention this right now. I'm going to be talking about something that happens in the finale. If you've been following Critical Role Campaign 3 up to this point, I don't think it's a huge shocker what happens. They've been alluding to it for a few months now. However, in case anyone wants to avoid that, just going to put a spoiler warning here. One thing I'll say before we get into the spoilery stuff, there has been talk for a little bit that because of how Campaign 3 was ending, that this was going to be the last time they did anything in Exandria or anything like that. Matt Mercer has come forward. I don't know if it was an Instagram post or somewhere else, but he did make a post that basically says he has a lot more stories to tell in Exandria specifically. He says Exandria. So this is not the end of Exandria or anything like that. But Exandria after Campaign 3 theoretically should be pretty different than Exandria before Campaign 3. And that's what I want to talk about. So here it is. Your spoiler warning. Everything from here on in is going to be very spoilerific. But the stuff that happened at the end of Campaign 3 inspired me specifically about a style of tabletop RPG campaign that really doesn't happen much. So, let's talk about it. So, at the end of Campaign 3, technically not the end of Campaign 3, at like 2.5 hours into the end of Campaign 3, there was still another 5 hours of the episode to go after this happened. Don't get me wrong, I love the Critical Role cast. I think Matt is a great storyteller. I think everyone there is phenomenal. But dear God, that did not need to be almost 9 hours long. Like, it really didn't. There was a lot of stuff in there that I think it would have been better to chop it into 2 episodes. Like, the first half of the episode before the break is dealing with the fact that Imogen is now the host of Predalos, or Predlith, the Hungerer. This god-eating deity, or super deity even. Like, it's not even a god. It's just something that entirely subsists on the life force of deities. To the point where it doesn't care about mortal races or anything that's not a deity. It can't see them. It is completely unaware that anything other than deities exists. And the only way for it to survive is to eat deities. Go nom 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 nom. So, and it's significantly more complicated than this, but effectively, Bell's Hells figures out that the only way to deal with Predalos, the God Eater, is to basically get rid of the gods. Because again, Imogen has been able to kind of look through the God Eater's eyes and understands how it thinks because of weird stuff that happened in Campaign 3. Not going to go into that. But she knows that this God Eater literally cannot see mortal creatures. It doesn't even know that they exist. So they come up with this idea that, hey, gods, if you want to continue existing, then you have to give up your godlike form and join the mortals. And if you don't, we're going to release the God Eater, and he's going to just nom all you guys. And so that's what the first, 2.5, 3 hours of the episode is about, is them trying to convince the gods, hey, it's better to be mortal and alive than immortal and dead. So, again, long story short, that part of the episode is really, really gripping. Because they're all doing their best to try and kind of convince all of the deities of Exandria that, hey, it's a good idea to just become mortal. And there's some really, really interesting, amazing moments. I won't spoil the kind of climax of that, but the end result is the gods agree to become mortal. And effectively, as far as I can understand, effectively that means that they all just stop existing right then and then have to be reincarnated into a new creature. And so all of the champions of the various deities are kind of contacted and said, hey, look out for me. I'm going to be reborn somewhere. You need to find me and protect me so I can grow up and continue doing my godly stuff, just in a mortal form. And from kind of a lore perspective, that creates a really interesting world to have adventures on. And this, and I want to explain exactly why that's such an interesting topic. The idea of the gods being forced to become mortals and walk the earth is not a new idea. They used to do it in Greek mythology all the time. In the Forgotten Realms, there is a specific period of time called the Time of Troubles. I actually did, on the All for Geek Alliance, my old collab channel, I actually did an episode of a series I used to do called Lore Explorer, where I talked specifically about the Time of Troubles, and I called it the Times of Trouble, which is a different thing that's part of Russian history. But the Time of Troubles, basically, the idea behind it was a few of the gods. In the Faerunian pantheon, you have the greater gods, you have the lesser gods, and then you have Io, who is the supreme over-god. And Io has these things called, if I remember correctly, they're the Tablets of Fate. But they're basically these tablets that list who are the greater gods and who are the lesser gods. And some of the lesser gods got it into their head that, oh, Io gets his power from these tablets, so if we steal them, we can overthrow Io and become greater gods. We could rule the gods. And so they end up doing that. Io gets pissed. He goes, really? You guys want to screw around with this? Fine. All of you go out there and deal with the problems that you keep creating by messing around with the mortals. I don't give a shit anymore. Get out of my heaven. And so he banishes all the gods but one, and I can't remember which god it was. And their only job was to protect the gates of heaven, to not allow the gods to come in. And so for a period of time, during this Time of Troubles, which if I remember correctly happened around, as far as D&D editions are concerned, I think the Time of Troubles was during 3rd edition. Okay, so let me... Time of Troubles... And then after the Time of Troubles, I think shortly after that was when the Spell Plague happened, which is what was the introduction to 4th edition. Because Spell Plague happens, and then everything gets shifted forward 100 years. Let's just figure this out real quick. Spell Plague year. 1385. So yeah, Time of Troubles happened in 1358 DR, and the Spell Plague happened in 1385. So I believe... Test of notes. Evening, Helm destroys Mistra. So yeah, at the end of the Times of Troubles, because Mister's trying to get back into heaven, if I remember correctly. I might be getting a little bit wrong, since it's been a long time since I've studied this portion of Realms lore. But Mister gets murdered, and because she's no longer holding on to the weave, it breaks. The spell plague happens, and that ravages the Forgotten Realms for like nearly 100 years. So anyway, when the Time of Troubles happened, it massively changed how the mortal races work, specifically when it comes to divine magic. Once they became mortal, anyone that used divine magic lost the ability to channel it unless they were within, I think it was a mile of the mortal avatar of their deity, because the deities were no longer omniscient. They were no longer omnipresent to where they could gift their spells anywhere. You had to be physically near your deity in order for them to be able to bless you with spells. And again, another thing that happened during the Time of Troubles was gods could die. They were mortal. And while, yes, they were mortal, they were still technically doing their jobs. Like Mistra was still overseeing the weave. She was just doing it from a mortal body. And then when she was killed, that caused the weave to go haywire and the spell plague to happen. So it wasn't just, well, the gods are mortal now, and so now there's no gods, or there's no thing. No, it didn't instantly just destroy divine magic as an idea, but it changed how everything worked instantly, and it allowed things that shouldn't have been able to happen to happen. It wasn't that gods couldn't die before. There had been gods that had died before, but it was not nearly as easy as just going up and murdering someone. So when we go to what's happening in Exandria, the first thing that we find out is divine magic seems to be completely unaffected, because the player characters are still able to cast divine spells. There's a couple different divine characters that actually have literally no change to their ability to use their spells. So that does bring up some interesting ideas. Again, from a kind of lore perspective and kind of a homebrew perspective, it does bring up some very interesting ideas. At this particular point, again, as soon as the gods gave up their mortality, they didn't instantly, like in the Time of Troubles for Forgotten Realms, they were actually cast down from heaven into mortal bodies. So they didn't stop existing for any period of time. They just instantly went from immortal to mortal and were kicked out. However, in Exandria, what is described is they stop existing and now have to actually be born into the world. And so the fact that divine magic is completely untouched, there's no change to it whatsoever, despite the fact that the creatures, the beings that were granting this divine magic simply don't exist currently, is a massive, massive deal. And it should be something that shakes up the very foundation of, well, what is divine magic? Because in D&D in general, hold on, I gotta get this back up. In D&D in general, there are multiple kind of flavors of magic, and the reason magic is kind of classified in different ways is because it actually works differently. Arcane magic, for the most part, is mortal created, meaning mortals are able to control it fully. They need no outside help. It is literally mortals interacting with the weave to get it to do the things that they want. A variation on arcane magic is pact magic. It's still arcane magic, but it's no longer being done by a mortal themselves. It's still technically, because a lot of I think the vast majority of things that you can make a pact with are not deities, which is why it's not defined as divine magic. But instead of the mortal being able to interact with the weave, their pact master is interacting with the weave for them. They have given them the ability to interact with the weave, but it's entirely done by the pact master. And again, it's still entirely done by mortals, effectively. When we get to things like nature magic, which, depending on the version of D&D, sometimes exists, sometimes it's an offshoot of divine magic. Nature magic is slightly... it's kind of like a hybrid between arcane and divine magic, where mortals are still instigating it, but the thing that is giving them their magic is literally just the overwhelming power of nature in itself, which generally is overseen by a deity, which is why in certain editions there isn't nature magic. It's just a different flavor of divine magic. And it's why things like druids and clerics have really similar spell lists, because they're technically getting it through this as the same source. But in that particular example, specifically for nature magic, the druid or the ranger or whatever is using the nature-based magic isn't technically interacting with the weave. They are interacting with nature, and nature is interacting with the weave. When we get to divine magic, it goes to an extreme level on the opposite direction. Divine magic is caused entirely by the gods. It's still technically instigated by a player casting the spell, but the player has literally no control, no interaction with the weave whatsoever. The gods are the ones that are actually doing it. They're the ones that are physically interacting with the weave, which is, again, one of the reasons why nature magic is sometimes considered divine, because technically it's a very similar process, with nature is the one that's interacting with the weave. When it's defined as nature magic or primal magic, the kind of differentiation is nature in and of itself doesn't have like a conscience or a will, and so it's still technically mortal focused magic because you're manipulating nature to cause magic. But once you get to the divine, literally the only thing that causes divine magic to happen is the gods make it happen. That's what defines divine magic. So when we go back to Exandria, the fact that the gods physically have no ability to actually interact with the weave in any way, shape, or form. They simply don't exist right now. You might be able to make an argument, well, yeah, they do exist. Maybe they're just babies right now in their parents' wombs or something. Fine, whatever. They still do not have the control that they had previously, and yet magic, divine magic, has not been affected in any way, shape, or form. So when we look at the idea of divine magic in the world of Exandria, that should make any cleric, any paladin, anyone that's actually studied divine magic immediately go, hang on a minute here. Thank you, phone. Hang on a minute here. How in the world am I still able to cast magic when I no longer have someone giving me the magic? How am I able to interact with the weave? Because I've never interacted with the weave. It's always been done on my behalf. And I think that creates a very, very interesting story to tell in the form of a tabletop RPG. There have been other settings where the gods have stopped existing for some reason or another. In Dark Sun, if I remember correctly, I think either the gods died or the gods just abandoned Athos completely after all the horrible stuff that happened during the various cleansings. So divine magic isn't a thing on the world of Athos because there's no gods. It's not like the gods are hiding. It's not like the gods went and become mortal. The gods don't exist. And so there is no divine magic. However, there are still clerics in the Dark Sun setting. And so what it was is clerics learned to get their magic in another way. There's two basically flavors of clerics. You have Templars who basically worship the sorcerer kings, these massively powerful defilers that run city-states. And a lot of them were the former people that were trying to cleanse the world of all the unclean races. Yeah, that's a thing in Dark Sun. They worship the sorcerer kings like their gods, and the sorcerer kings are effectively able to manipulate the weave in a similar way that a deity would. And so you have Templars that have that, and then you also have elemental clerics where they worship the kind of physical embodiment of the various elementals. And each elemental cleric has to worship one of four elemental spheres: fire, water, air, or earth. So, because there are no deities left on Athos, the elemental forces basically became deities of their own nature, but they're not quite the same. And so, divine magic on Athos is significantly more similar to pact magic than it is kind of traditional divine magic. In a completely different example of that, on the world of Kryn, there was a situation where the gods, if I remember correctly, it's for their own protection, decided to leave the world. It wasn't they were killed or anything. They voluntarily decided to kind of leave the world for a while. And when that happened, divine magic stopped working completely. And the interesting thing about the world of Kryn, which is Dragonlance, if anyone's unfamiliar. The interesting thing about the world of Kryn is when the gods left, and if I remember correctly, it was because you had a bunch of people like doing bad stuff, very kind of Netherese-esque. If you're familiar with the Forgotten Realms, where they're like, well, we're going to become gods, and the gods went, no, you're not. They spanked them down and then went, we're done with this. You guys, nope. And so when they left, they also took all of their clerics with them. And so for a long time, people just assumed that the gods were dead or things like that, because literally divine magic in and of itself stopped working because all the divine magic practitioners were gone and the gods left. The first Dragonlance novels, one of the main characters is the first cleric able to use divine magic in hundreds of years. And you eventually, what they eventually find out is that the gods didn't like completely abandon the planet. They just went silent. And so it wasn't that divine magic couldn't happen. It was that the gods were no longer granting it. And eventually one of the gods finally decided to grant it. So again, another very unique way to deal with deities just disappearing. And again, all of those make for really interesting stories and worlds to deal with. I don't know if this happened on Kryn in the Dragonlance novels, but it is something that's happened in my personal campaign setting, because in my campaign setting, the gods exist, they're just completely silent, for reasons that none of my players have discovered, but some of them may be discovering it very quickly here. And so because the gods are completely silent, divine magic still exists, the gods still grant divine magic, but they don't impart their will on it or anything like that. It's almost entirely dictated by the high priests of each one of the deities, who are only known by an epithet. Nobody knows the gods' names. They just know them as like the Dark Lady, the Valiant Warrior, the Gentle Gardener, and there are many reasons behind that in my lore. But what it turned into was there are quite a few high-ranking clerics and priests that claim that the gods speak exclusively through them, and therefore they get to dictate how their particular religion works, things like that. And that's always an interesting story to tell when you're dealing with deities that are either completely silent or non-existent, that people still believe in, still put faith in. So I think Exandria going forward, I think a subplot has to involve, or doesn't have to, but I think a subplot needs to eventually evolve having a divine magic user actually have to kind of deal with the fact that either divine magic is not given to us by the gods, or something else is going on here. Because the gods stopped existing for a decent amount of time, for decades. And yet divine magic still works the exact same way it did before. It wasn't like divine magic was here, but it worked differently. It wasn't like, well, I can't get any more levels in cleric because divine magic, so all the stuff I used to have, I still have, but I can't get any more. No, it worked identically. And again, that might just be, hey, it was the end of the campaign. I don't want to have to deal with stuff like that because it was a 9-hour-long finale. But we may find out that divine magic has changed since the gods became mortal. We don't know. But that in and of itself I find really, really fascinating. The other thing that I think would make an amazing storyline in a future campaign, whether Matt Mercer does it or whether you do it at your table at home, is the idea of, now that the gods are mortal, one of the things that comes up in the epilogue is the idea that all of the champions of the gods are basically told before the gods kind of meet up with their champions. He goes, hey, dudes, company meeting. We are going into bankruptcy. However, we're going to come out of bankruptcy. We're going to be even better than before. But I'm going to be a baby. So you guys need to be searching the world and figuring out when I get reborn so that you can protect me. And that theme comes up over and over and over again. As soon as the deities are reborn, their churches or their temples, whatever you want to call them, are going to be searching for these children that are gods, and are going to find them and try to protect them, because the enemies of those deities are going to be attempting to get rid of them. And as far as I can infer from the stuff that Matt said during the finale, what it sounds like is, if when the gods die again, whether they are murdered, whether they die of old age or whatever, they're just going to be continually reincarnated over and over and over again. So it's not like just going up and murdering the baby version of the Matron of Ravens is going to end their... No, they'll just be reborn again somewhere else. But there has to be some kind of... there has to be some kind of effect of the deity dying. Like, again, if the gods are now in this reincarnation cycle, and every time they reincarnate, nothing happens, nothing changes, there's no reason for them to be protected. And again, it brings up the idea of what exactly were the gods doing if they can completely change how their existence works and nothing in existence changes. An interesting story, an interesting couple stories that could happen in this new flavor of Exandria would be things like, first of all, finding a deity before the rest of their temple have found them, and then having to kind of protect that deity. From a tabletop RPG standpoint, the idea of a campaign long I can't think of the escort quest. There's the word I was looking for. The idea of a campaign-long escort quest could probably get really old really, really quickly. But if done correctly, it could turn into something really fascinating. On the other hand, how do you know which baby is the god baby? And I think that's another story that could be really, really interesting. Eventually, someone is going to be able to figure out how to fake being a reincarnated god. Because, I mean, that happens in real life. Like, how many times have we had somebody claim to be the reincarnation of some prophet or some really important figure in some religion? Happens all the time. And every single time, some people believe them. And so, in an instance where the gods actually can be reincarnated, that could create a really interesting story where it might even create like a rift in the temple, where you have, well, these people believe that this is the true reincarnation of the Matron of Ravens, and these people believe that this is the true incarnation. It could turn into a war and other things. Like, those are really, really interesting, fascinating stories to be able to tell, especially since eventually someone's going to figure out how to stop the reincarnation cycle. And then you're going to be able to tell a story about, well, you know, this person figured out that if you kill them with a special dagger, or you kill them at a certain time or in a certain place, they won't get reincarnated, and that god will just simply cease to exist. Well, then that creates an interesting story that you're going to have to deal with. In the same realm, somebody, I mean, they've already touched on the idea of mortals becoming gods with, I think it was called the Rite of Ascension. Campaign 1 was about Vecna attempting, or the end of Campaign 1 was Vecna attempting to become an actual god. So somebody, especially with this reincarnation thing, somebody's going to either figure out how to absorb the reincarnation energy so that they can take over, or they're going to find a way to make them join the reincarnation cycle and they get to go. Like, these are all stories that would be really, really interesting, compelling things to deal with, especially since you eventually have to deal with the idea of, well, what do the gods do? Like, literally, what do they do? If another god shows up and wants to take the Matron of Raven's portfolio, what happens? What happens when there's two deities that are existing specifically to be the gods of death? Again, more Exandrian lore. Matron of Ravens isn't the first god of death. She was a mortal that ascended to godhood, I think, before the Age of Arcanum, and replaced the other god of death, who was her lover. Complicated, weird the thing, but that was the first instance of the Rite of Ascension working. So they have laid the groundwork for a lot of divine-based, interesting campaigns that could go forward. That could be the main plot of a campaign, or could be like a plot of a single character. That's one of the things that I think Campaign 1 did better than both Campaign 2 and Campaign 3, was in Campaign 1, every single character had their own adventure, had their own journey that they were on that happened to involve the rest of Vox Machina. As we get later and later, you start having less and less adventures, you know, each person having their own personal, like, if you look at Campaign 2, you basically had the Traveler was the kind of adventure and focus of Laura's character, Jester, and Ford had his stuff with Uk'otoa. Both of those things were resolved before the quote-unquote main conflict really got going, and they didn't really affect the story massively compared to something like Percy's Briarwood arc, and it ended up that the Briarwoods were working for Vecna, and so there was this personal story, and the Chroma Conclave was intrinsically linked to Vexen Vax, and like every single person, and the Aramente was Keyleth having to become the ruler of a new nation, or not a new nation, but of her nation, which affected everything all the way through campaign 3. But when you get to campaign 3, like early campaign 3 is just a bunch of nonsense where not a whole lot really feels like it matters, and then everything is about Laura's character, Imogen. Everything is about Imogen. Imogen is the chosen one. Imogen is the most important being in existence. And everybody else kind of goes with it because they're all part of the party. Not saying that Campaign 3 was bad in any way, shape, or form. That is a story that you can tell. However, the kind of personal stories of each character just really weren't as interesting. Laudna was Imogen's girlfriend. That's what it was. Laudna has an amazing, incredible story that links back to Campaign 1. It's very rarely touched on aside from dealing with Delilah in her head. Everything always comes back to Imogen. So if we're talking about like the deities becoming mortal, then you could have a personal subplot of a character of, hey, you know, my god, I was a personal protector of my deity. They were murdered under my watch, and now my job is to kind of wait for their reincarnation to show up. And that could be a really interesting subplot that also gets resolved into the larger plot, but you'd still have that subplot. I think that could be really, really interesting. So, yeah. Overall, I did not watch the vast majority of Campaign 3. I think in total, I watched maybe 5 or 6 episodes, including the finale. And I watched the entirety of the finale, guys. The very, very end of the finale was really nice and sweet. I won't talk about what it was, but it was really nice. So I was not heavily invested in Campaign 3. But overall, the finale, and I read synopses and stuff like that so I could at least keep up with where the story was going. I just didn't watch the show because it's too long. The finale, I think, should have been a 2-part finale. I think all the stuff that happened before the break and the stuff that happened immediately after the break should have been 1 episode, and then all the resolutions, because they resolved everything for Bell's Hells. Every single person got to sunset their character. If you're not familiar with the term, sunsetting your character is basically the campaign is over. Describe to me how you want your character to retire. Like, what do you imagine your character doing now that they're no longer an adventurer? So everybody got to sunset their Bell's Hells characters. Then, because the world had changed so much and they'd brought back the Mighty Nine over and over again, everybody went through and sunsetted their Mighty Nine characters. And then, because the world has changed massively, everybody went through and sunsetted their Vox Machina characters again. They'd already sunsetted the Mighty Nine and the Vox Machina characters at the end of their relative campaigns, but they let them sunset them again because this really was kind of the culmination of all 3 campaigns. Yeah. Interested to hear what you guys think. If you listen to me ramble on for almost 40 minutes about this nonsense, what do you guys think, first of all, about the changes that happened to Exandria itself? And second of all, the idea of kind of divine magic. Do you like the idea of it is granted by the gods, which is kind of the traditional way that D&D describes it? Do you like it more of the idea that it's entirely faith-based, to where it's actually something that comes entirely from mortals, but it comes from their belief in a deity, because that means divine magic works very, very differently than if it is given by a god. Or do you have a different flavor of divine magic in either your campaigns or in the tabletop RPGs that you play, and it works differently than both those things? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, it's all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.